Play!
I can't play.
Play!
Yes, ma'am.
What you've just heard is a song request by a mysterious hooded skeleton that torments Mickey Mouse in the 1929 cartoon The Haunted House. There is very little dialogue, but a lot of song and dance, particularly by skeletons who use each other's bones as musical instruments. It's not particularly scary, but provides another piece of evidence that from Disney's earliest days there were Gothic elements populated by the monstrous. Yet, for the most part, there seems always to be an element of silliness in Disney's Gothic. For example, before Ghostbusters hit screens in 1984, Disney produced a cartoon in 1937 called Lonesome Ghosts, which featured Mickey, Goofy, and Donald as ghost exterminators who are prank called by ghosts.
Hey, this is an idea. Get a load of this, fellers. Notice, we exterminate all kinds of ghosts. Day and night service.
Do you chase ghosts?
Do we chase ghosts?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. I'll say we do.
Come quick.
Okay, we'll be right over.
The three ghost hunters show up to the Gothic home and spend the next several minutes being tormented by slapstick pranks. The whole thing ends with Mickey, Goofy, and Donald covered in molasses and flour, making them look like ghosts and subsequently terrifying the real spooks who run out of the house. This brings up another element of Disney's Gothic. Even when things are a bit more serious, there is something hopeful at the end to chase away the darkness. In the 1940 film Fantasia, which includes a scene of Mickey as a sorcerer's apprentice who lets the magic get out of control, there is an ending sequence involving Night on Bald Mountain. This song was composed by Modest Mussorgsky, who drew inspiration from the Russian folktale St. John's Eve on Bald Mountain, which depicts a witch's Sabbath. In Disney's film, we see a demonic figure, Chernabog, awaken on Bald Mountain and summon all kinds of evil spirits. However, unlike the Russian folktale, the song and Disney film end the Gothic nightmare with the ringing of church bells that chase the evil away. Part of Disney's making silly that which is scary has to do with Walt Disney's faith. Walt Disney grew up in a Congregational church in Missouri. We'll look at some of his religious reflections more in depth in the next episode, but for now what's important to note is that Disney's approach to the macabre is partially influenced by how the Christian worldview trusts in the hope of death being defeated. In other words, the House of Mouse isn't just haunted by the obvious Gothic images we see, but also a faith-based perspective on death. For example, in passages like 1 Corinthians 15:55, we read, "O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory?" The tone is defiant and unafraid. Death is an enemy, but it's defeated, and therefore we don't have to live in a constant state of hand-wringing and pearl-clutching. But even so, is it appropriate to make light of such dark themes and images? In the book Disney Gothic, Dark Shadows in the House of Mouse, there is a chapter called From Gothic to Gags, Disney's Comic Deconstruction of Death. It is written by Dr. Terry Lindvall, C.S. Lewis Chair of Communication at Virginia Wesleyan University, and I am delighted to have him on the podcast as my guest. This is the third episode in our Disney series, and it's entitled The Dark Side of Disney, Haunted Mouse. I'm Dr. Seth Pierce, and welcome to Beast and Bible. Terry, thank you so much for coming on Beast and Bible.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So just as an icebreaker, I want to talk about something that's a little bit niche to those of us who study communication and media. When I was in my doctoral program, I came into it as somebody who did a Master of Divinity coming out of a pastoral context. And I remember after our first class at Regent University, we were eating in one of the local restaurants, sitting around the table with other people who had a master's in communication. They'd come out of communication programs. And we were just chatting. And in the middle of this conversation about the program and our hopes and dreams and whatever, I said something along the lines of, yeah, I'm really finding communications interesting. And the whole table stopped and looked at me like I said the deplorable word from Magician's Nephew. Like there was this sort of micro upheaval. And I was rebuked thoroughly. And like, it's communication, not communications. And, since then I've learned the difference. And I remember like hammering this into my students. But as somebody who studies communication, can you tell us what is the difference between the study of communication and communications?
Yeah, communication basically is the art of rhetoric. It goes back to Aristotle and Plato and everyone else. And it's the art of not only expressing, but really kind of conveying a meaning to other people. Communications with an S on it basically is the telegraph, it's the internet, it's the technology. Yeah. And so if you want to study communications, that's fine. But you've got to recognize you're not really dealing with the kind of human art or craft of expressing yourself and finding meaning with another person.
That's good. Yeah. And it's an important distinction. I think, just someone who is, I've been a program director, I've been a professor, and often trying to explain the difference to people, even students. Yeah. So thank you. Good icebreaker. It's important. So for all those of you who are listening, whether you're come from a religious background, communication background, whatever, that's the distinction. But now getting into some of your work, you are currently the C.S. Lewis Chair of Communication and Christian Thought at Virginia Wesleyan University. Now, a lot of people might associate C.S. Lewis with English or theology. Can you talk a little bit about the connection between C.S. Lewis and communication?
I come also from a background. My undergraduate was in biology and English literature at Vanguard University. It was Southern California College back in the 60s. And from there, I had a full fellowship to go to a doctoral program in biochemistry. And my friend Ben Fraser persuaded me to go to seminary with him and stay in Southern California rather than go to New Mexico. And I said, why? He said, this is where all the women are. So I said, okay, I'll go to seminary. But there were no women at the seminary, Fuller Seminary at the time. So I got my MDiv and worked through and never felt a call to the ministry per se. But as I went on, I took a course on film and theology. And it just really began to kind of open my imagination to some of the possibilities of how we can communicate to our culture. And so I applied to the University of Southern California and got in there to the doctoral program. And in the doctoral program, my advisor, Walter Fisher, who is the father of narrative communication, some of his great work on looking at the motive views of communication, he really began to shape my thinking. And my dissertation became a 600 word be perfect.
Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah.
A 600-page dissertation on C.S. Lewis's theory of communication. And so trying to bring together his thoughts from everything on medieval literature to his fantasy and science fiction and his poetry. What does he have to say about communication? How does it really kind of apply to us today? So I found that he had so many timeless thoughts that really began to kind of shape my thinking about communication and my calling.
That's awesome. I know I took Dr. Fraser's course over at Oxford University as one of my residencies, studying C.S. Lewis and a little bit of Tolkien. Can you give us just like
Ben now? You may call him Ben.
I know it's so hard. When
he's really one of the most artificial doctors you'll ever meet. So I'm kidding. I love it. We've been friends since 1967, so we go way back.
No, it's so hard. Like I still have, even like some of my older seminary professors, I have to willfully force myself to call them by their first name. It's so difficult. So can you give us just a sampling? So again, I did his course over at Oxford and saw the connection, but just a simple, sampling of some major principles and themes from C.S. Lewis as it relates to communication.
That's a really good question. I think he wrote an article on Before We Can Communicate, and basically set out kind of three principles I think that are very important for people. He said, first of all, you really have to know that the first barrier is language. If we are going to another country, we're going to China, we're going to France, we have to learn the language, and the language of our culture changes. It evolves, it develops, and we lose some of the particular meanings that we have. And so we've got to understand kind of not only the culture, but the mental habits and the linguistic behavior of the people we're talking to. The jargon of contemporary English has changed radically. I mean, since I was in college. And so I need to understand how people view words. One of the first things I did in a communication class when I first started teaching is I sent my students out. I was teaching at Azusa Pacific University. And I had them go out and just talk to people who weren't Christians and ask them about Christian words. For example, what does a Christian mean? What does Catholic mean? And Catholic, of course, means universal, but they always thought it meant Roman Catholic.
Right.
What does the Immaculate Conception mean? Do they believe in it? And most people thought it meant the virgin birth when it actually means the sinless condition of Mary. And so people had no understanding. Most people said they were spiritual, and spiritual is something that is so kind of amorphous for many people. And it really means anything but sensuous. And the problem is Christianity is both a flesh religion. It's a religion of the body, of the incarnation, as well as the spirit. And the spirit can be evil as everything else. But the fun word I had back in the early 70s was I sent them out with the word rapture. I said, find out what they think the word rapture means, because that was the time of dispensational theology and Hal Lindsey and all of that.
Right.
And for many people, it meant, this kind of sudden deliverance of people from the tribulation and everything else.
Yeah.
But usually for most people, rapture meant sexual ecstasy. And so when they'd see a bumper sticker that said, in case of rapture, this car will be empty, they had a totally different image of what was going on in that car at that time. And so we have to learn the language. That was the first thing then. And Lewis's great contribution here is basically saying that we need to be able to kind of translate our theology into the vernacular.
Yeah.
How can we find the language of people? And he said, basically, we don't really understand our theology until we begin to express it in ways that our next door neighbor, our grocer, our whoever, our coffee maker, someone understands. And if we can communicate that way, we find that we are beginning to understand as well. The second thing he said, a major problem is apathy. Most people don't care. It's like that old story of the couple kind of looking at the internet, a program on euthanasia. And the husband basically says, I want you to know, honey, that if I ever get into a vegetative state, dependent on some machine, I want you to pull the plug. And so she gets up and goes over to the computer and pulls the plug because we are just so apathetic. We're so kind of conditioned by what's out there. And people don't realize how odd reality really is. Yeah. And this is where I think we'll get later on into some of the kind of grotesque and really strange things that are out there that God has planted in our world. Yeah. But we'll talk about that later. And the third thing he says is basically the concept of sin is something that people don't understand. Generally, he says people don't see themselves as drunkards. Most people don't see fornication as a sin. And so if you try to talk about those kind of sins, you're missing the whole boat. What you need to talk about is the sin that you are wrestling with at the moment. You need to be identified as a sinner. Instead of judging someone else, you say, okay, here's where I am. I see selfishness. I see spite. I see resentment. I see a judgmental attitude. These things people can connect with because they are sins that we all taste. And so Lewis kind of brought those three things together. Translate your theology into the language, basically can wake people up from their apathy. And then third, kind of identify with their sin, with your own sin. And you'll find that you'll be able to communicate the gospel, the good news, even better.
You could almost say, matching the language, translating it, developing empathy. And so, trying to figure out, like you said, those moments where we all struggle and experience tension and disappointment and realizing we're probably not the only people who have these feelings, and then connecting that way. And so moving a little bit, as we're creeping, closer to Disney Gothic, mentioning how language changes. When we're looking at popular culture, that's something that definitely has an impact on language. When my wife and I started dating, I explained to her, I said, you have to watch the Star Wars trilogy because you will not understand half the conversations in my house, if you don't understand all the references, that happen. And I think you can look at, whether it's Chronicles of Narnia, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, The Matrix. I mean, there's so many, films that come out that, they're not just an entertainment, we went there for 2-3 hours, had a great time, but they're so influential. They shift language and they shift meaning. And looking at C.S. Lewis, he certainly wrote nonfiction, but he's probably best known for the Chronicles of Narnia. And so looking at fiction and fantasy and media, and sometimes this is an area of tension for people of faith. It's not seen as practical, it's seen as a waste of time, or it's seen as dangerous. So just to start, what practical spiritual value is there for people of faith to create and consume works in the fantasy fiction, genre?
Basically, wonderful question, but it's so large as well. I think fantasy really appeals to our imagination. We think in images many times. And I go back to Pope Gregory. One thing, after I was fired from a university after 25 years being there, and it was a great experience. You don't see God's providence in it when you're fired, but you wonder,
Right.
where are we going next? But I ended up at a place where I had to teach a little bit in religious studies and then also in communication. And one of the courses I had to teach was a year's long course on church history. And as I began to read church history, I looked at it from the vantage points of a communication scholar. How did communication change through all of this? And Pope Gregory the Great really got involved in what was known as the iconoclastic controversy, where there were certain Christians who were trying to kind of attack the idea of using images in the communication. And so they were taking up the idea of the graven image from the Ten Commandments. They were taking up the idea of this kind of idolatry of the Muslims, where you could not kind of create this image of the prophet or anyone else. And they really became kind of fundamentalist, attacking and destroying images. And many of the Calvinists kind of took this over as well. But Pope Gregory came out before the Calvinists and said there are three reasons we have to use images. He said, first is because of illiteracy. Most people cannot read. They do not understand words. And so when you give them an image, they can begin to understand the story. And for that age, the Middle Ages, people were illiterate. Very few people could read the Latin. Today, we've come back to the same place. Fewer people read, and people can read images, and they go to images for their information and their news. Secondly, he said, because of sloth. Words sometimes don't move us unless you get into stories.
Yeah.
Words are just easy to kind of read and then process and think rationally. But images move you. Most of us remember kind of those images that really had an impact on us. When you've seen the movie Jaws, you remember shark attacks.
Yep.
When you see Star Wars, there are moments that just stick in your memory. And that gets to the third reason he said we use images is for memory. We remember movies. We remember artworks where we don't remember sermons or lectures or podcasts. Those things are disappearing from our memory almost immediately. And so we need to be recognizing how to communicate to the popular culture of images where we are now, including TikTok.
Yeah. No, I agree. And those are excellent, very practical things. And, one thing I've noted too, particularly in my own tradition, sort of is it comes out of the 19th century and almost kind of a Victorian mindset where fiction and novels and things of that nature are not seen as productive. They're useless. They're wastes of time. You're not planting potatoes. You're not, building a building, like, what are you doing? Just wasting your time. And I think as we've studied imagination and we've maybe learned a little bit more, we realize, okay, there's certainly, media that are not great to consume, but, not everything, first of all, has to be about me working, and I think even looking at, Sabbath theology, the idea of just sitting back and appreciating beauty and rest and enjoying a good story. And then one thing, getting into C.S. Lewis and Tolkien a little bit. And again, I'm slowly creeping towards the Gothic for people who are listening, because this will all connect. Often what I've seen, I'm just going to pick on C.S. Lewis, like The Magician's Nephew. Lewis's mother died when he was very young, and it was a huge source of grief and trauma for him, as well as his schooling. And then you read books like The Magician's Nephew, where the protagonist's mother is dying, or there's little snide remarks about school. And, as far as I know, and maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, Lewis did not attend like therapy sessions, didn't have, a form that we know of, maybe like a counselor, like we would think of. But fiction became a way for him to get some emotional distance and to process some of the feelings and traumas, whether it was family, whether it was his service in the war. And I know Tolkien was a little bit the same way. And there's other theorists, Julia Kristeva is another one who talks a little bit about this, who points out that in therapy, often people, writing things down or fictionalizing, the very real historical narratives in their life allows them some distance to sort of process. Has that been kind of true in your experience?
Yes.
Good. Moving on.
That was a good long question. I thought giving a quick answer might be really fun. So
yeah, no, that's good. Yeah,
I think what's interesting is Lewis also talked about two kinds of knowing, dealing with epistemology and how we know things. And this was, I think, very important for him because dealing with suffering and pain, he wrote a book called The Problem of Pain. And he really kind of disavowed kind of as an author. He said, if I do experience pain, I wouldn't have this kind of rational argument that I would kind of come to.
Right.
But then in his fiction, he begins to kind of process. He works it out. As you mentioned, at the end of The Magician's Nephew, when Daggery gets this opportunity to heal his mother, is he going to do it? Is he going to take this temptation? But that's only kind of the second part. The third part then becomes this truly kind of emotive story in A Grief Observed, where his wife Joy has died, and he used the pseudonym T.W. Clark, basically to kind of express his really deep emotions of how I'm going to process this now in writing again. So it becomes a wonderful way in which we can kind of express those kind of anxieties and those fears and the kinds of crises we go through in different ways. And it's very important. But if you have somebody that you can talk to, that's just as good. I mean, that's a wonderful, that's a gift from God to have those kinds of friends that are with you when you go through. And Lewis developed those. He had his brother Warney, who was very good. They were both alienated in a way from their father, particularly Jack. But they had each other, and then friendships developed. And Lewis's friendships, as you know, were mainly Christians. And he wasn't a Christian. He was an atheist. And these Christians like Owen Barfield and then Tolkien and Charles Williams all began to kind of shape who he was. Yeah.
No, that's good. And this is, where I was leading, kind of dovetailing off of your comments and into our focus, for today, is looking at the Gothic as a genre, particularly as it relates to Disney and as it relates to faith. The Gothic is a genre that I think most people who are unfamiliar with it, or maybe they just consume it and they just enjoy it as entertainment. They think of darkness and death and tombstones and crumbly old castles and mansions, and it's certainly something that brushes up against horror and pain and suffering and maybe freaks people out. They don't want to, participate in it, because of that. But the more I've read, there are some definite existential spiritual questions that I think are worth exploring in the genre. And so as we're moving to this darker subject now, you are a contributor to a fascinating monograph that came out this year called Disney Gothic, Dark Shadows in the House of Mouse, which I loved your chapter. I loved the book. I have lots of notes, highlights, scribbles, in the margins. How did you become involved in this project?
I was at a seance. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Not
I
at all.
see people commenting, and that's going to be the clip that goes on social media. Yeah,
not at all. I would run from that. Basically, one of my friends, a colleague, Kathy Murlock Jackson, she was the former president of Popular Culture Association and the editor of the Journal of Popular Culture. And she's a great, great scholar, particularly a Disney scholar. She wrote the biobibliography of him and many other articles. And so she always drafts me to kind of join in books with her. Before this one, there was one on liminal spaces in fantasy. And so I wrote an article, which is way out of my competence completely, on liminal spaces of gardens in C.S. Lewis's Narnia and Hutchinson's The Secret Garden, talking about little girls going through liminal spaces. And my feminist colleagues are just laughing at me, saying, Kerry, what do you know about this? I said, I don't know. I was drafted to do this. Yeah. And so after doing that article, she said, well, Terry, I'll give you something you know more about. kind of supernatural horrors and terrors. Yeah. And so she invited me to kind of join them and the editors. And they were just really good people to work with, where we all explore kind of the darker side of Disney. And most of us see Disney as the happiest place on earth. I don't anymore. I've kind of come to kind of negotiate that in a different way. But sure, we see the kind of brightness of the Disney stories. And so I just took some of his early black and white cartoons in which he deals with the Gothic And the Gothic includes not only kind of haunted houses, ghosts, but bats and skeletons and kind of dark and stormy nights. All of these aspects were Walt Disney really had not shaken them off. He had read a lot of the Grimm brothers fairy tales. He had this kind of awareness, I think, in himself as someone who had gone to a congregational church of the power of sin and darkness. And when we live life just open, we realize there is a dark side to us. I mean, George MacDonald influenced C.S. Lewis so powerfully in his book Phantastes. And in it, Anados, who means kind of without a path, he doesn't know where he's wandering in this kind of dream world, he discovers his shadow and he can't get rid of his shadow. And there's something in all of us that recognizes that there's something wrong with this world. There's something uncanny. There's something frightening. And Christianity is able to identify it. And it recognizes it not just sin, but kind of an evil presence that does coexist alongside of us that we have to be aware of. Disney kind of comes and sees the shadows, and he kind of hints at them in films like Something Wicked This Way Comes, or the films I dealt with, The Mad Doctor, or Hell's Bells. Just some funny little things that he starts with the gloom.
I remember as a parent, with my eldest, and when they're old enough, you start watching a few movies, and I had not watched like Disney princess movies since I was really little, and you think, okay, and then you play it, and then you see some of the characters like Maleficent, in the cartoon, not the retelling, which I found really well done with Angelina Jolie, but whether it's Maleficent, whether it's Ursula, whether it's the Wicked Stepmothers, and this gets into a whole thing about Disney and women and sort of this archetype evil mother figure. But a lot of the villains are truly villainous. There's some really frightening moments. There's even Fantasia, which has the song, what is it, Night on Bald Mountain, which is about a Black Sabbath and witches and this demonic, is it Cherubog or whatever, this demonic figure, and you're like, man, there's some darkness. I forgot about it just because Disney's marketing is so good at making it the happiest place on earth. But even in recent films like Pirates of the Caribbean, you definitely have is it Barbossa telling the heroine as well as the audience, this is a ghost story essentially, and there is this darkness to Disney. I shared with our listeners this season a little bit about Disney's Christian upbringing and sort of how he approaches this a little bit in terms of how he discusses death and darkness. And I think you do a really good job in your chapter, which is called From Gothic to Gags, Disney's comic deconstruction of death, as far as looking at sort of the lighthearted approach that Disney takes to death. Can you give us a brief overview of the chapter and a few takeaways as they relate to media and faith?
Disney was, I think, aware of this whole medieval tradition of Holbein and Dürer and these great artists who could create these skeletal figures of death. And they would often be in the background where you'd have a preacher, but behind him would be a skeleton of death kind of holding a jawbone, which is an ironic comment on his preaching as well. Or you find a young girl at an altar praying, and she's got her suitor, kind of romantic suitor up the side, but without realizing behind her is another skeleton of death about to snuff out her candle. And then you've got all of the hierarchy of religion, from the priest to the bishop to the pope, and death stands behind them as well. And so they see these skeletal figures from the Middle Ages, and they become these numinous objects. They become kind of the reminders of death, memento mori, in the Dance Macabre, this kind of very kind of scary death thing. But what they do, these artists who have seen the plague, they've seen famine, they've seen war, they've seen destruction and death, they're able to kind of step away and show that death is an enemy, but it's an enemy that is defeated in the Christian tradition. Death, oh grave, where is the victory? Oh death, where is your sting? Paul kind of quotes that old saying. And Disney, while kind of more of a generic Christian, I wouldn't call him kind of orthodox in many ways.
Right.
He was kind of lax in his kind of worship and everything else. Still had enough, I think, of a Sunday school education that he knew that death was an enemy that was defeated. And so what I did in this chapter was I took some of the cartoons that start with these dark and stormy nights, with the skeletons coming out, the skulls, the bats, the black cats. And I took it and I said how he starts with death, how he starts with the idea of the numinous, but really quickly it becomes vaudeville. It becomes carnival. It becomes something that is silly, something that on the other side of death we can laugh at. At this point, we're still walking through the valley of the shadow of death, and it's scary. Death is still very serious. It's not in this kind of Buddhist tradition of being an illusion. It is real, and it hurts, and we have the loss and the pain and the suffering. But from the other side, we'll be able to look and say, no, there's something that is a divine comedy in all of this. And so that's what I tried to do, of take us how Disney, in his kind of silly symphony way, was really taking us from the fear of death to the fact that there is going to be a victory over death, if you believe in the resurrection.
Yeah. And I think two pieces come to mind that I think your article focused on where you see this is the Silly Symphony, which is early Disney silent film. You've got this scene that opens up in hell and sort of these silly devil antics, where one of the devils gets the better of Satan and I think he falls off a cliff, and it's weird, and I remember.
Yeah, it's very much like Screwtape. I mean, Screwtape letters. The fact that Lewis has these two devils, Screwtape and Wormwood, kind of writing letters back and forth to each other. And he, like Martin Luther and Sir Thomas More, said basically you've got to mock the devil. The devil is there to be mocked. Luther all the time, because he had constipation, was kind of in the laboratory and just saying, okay, Satan, you heard me fart. You're going to write that down on my sins now? And he was one of the most executorial theologians we've ever had.
Yes, he is. Yeah.
But here, I think Disney is kind of playing with that as well.
Okay. And then the other one, and you mentioned vaudeville, and I think this really comes out in the haunted house with Mickey, which is kind of a Halloween, classic. I see it show up along with Huey, Dewey, and Louie's, Trick or Treat. But it opens up again, dark and stormy night. All the Gothic tropes are there. And then as Mickey, comes into this house, there's this sort of skeletal, ghostly figure. Reminds me a little bit of the ghost of Christmas Future. Tells him to play the piano, and he starts playing, and everyone starts dancing, and it's silly. It's this sort of carnivalizing the macabre. And so, just to kind of summarize your thoughts, you're seeing that Disney approaches this acknowledging death. Yep, there's darkness, there's evil, there's death. But also because of the victory that Christians claim in Christ, we don't have to be afraid of this stuff. We can make fun of it. Is that kind of the gist?
What seems harrowing basically turns out hilarious. And if you notice in one of the cartoons, Mickey is praying. He prays before he goes to sleep and has a nightmare, which is more of a marital nightmare, but it's kind of a Gothic nightmare as well.
Yeah.
But Disney puts prayers into some of his films. I mean, even Snow White prays at some point for Grumpy. And so even in these kind of horrible times, you get these kind of moments and tropes of piety that Disney kind of was raised with.
Terry noted that Walt likely drew from a long history of Christian art depicting various gloomy scenes. We easily forget that Christian art history doesn't begin with Thomas Kinkade, but has numerous depictions of judgment and hell and death that reappear in contemporary media. Terry noted that even though Disney was a nominal Christian, there is still a sense that as serious as death is, it's always defeated. This allows Disney to create silly breaks in gloomier narratives. Terry also highlights the use of prayer in Disney films, which seems like it could be its own research project. It doesn't appear to be deployed in a mocking sense, but simply what one does when faced with danger. Of course, some will still wonder if this is a safe thing to do. I mean, is it dangerous to create these narratives that juxtapose the seriousness of eternal judgment and scary images with silly, whimsical song and dance numbers? Isn't there a risk to opening up people to the occult, or at least a fascination with it? That's the subject of our next episode. Hope you'll tune in. Thanks for listening.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.